Hey there, welcome back one more time to the Crazy Libertarian. You're listening to the always awesome 88.1 FM. That is KPPPLP Fargo, K more than 2, less than 4 Ps, LP Fargo. That call-in number is 701-566-0917. One more time, 701-566-0917. So I'm going to skip a lot of the other nonsense that I talk about in the news and all that stuff today because I want to have sort of a manifesto moment here, right? So, I've been thinking a lot. I've been thinking a lot about the things that I've talked about on this show and the conversations that we've had really as a country over the last, let's call it 2 decades, right? We've had discussions about these wars. We had a peace deal that kind of broke down, kind of didn't with the Taliban. We've had a bunch of stuff. We've had discussions about the war on drugs. What I really want to kind of focus on is one kind of common thread throughout much of these discussions, for most of the time that we've had these discussions, is that the game plan that we're using, and that has been the game plan that we've used since, really in both Middle Eastern affairs and the drug war. Hell, you can go back to at least Ronald Reagan, right? And it's been pretty consistent, no matter if you have a donkey or a Republican or an elephant in office. But we've known for a while that this hasn't worked, and even after the post 9/11 fever pitched after, about 2004, even after the war on drugs fever pitched in the early 90s, late 80s, we're still doing these exact same policies that were inspired in the moment of fear or irrationality. And by the way, that a lot of people are like, hey, this won't work out in the long term. To begin with, we've had politicians make their lives on promising change. Obama came in 2008, and all that he did was expand everything that he said that he was going to fight with Bush. We had Trump come in, said he was going to cut the federal deficit, get the troops home. Granted, he's made efforts on that, but only half-heartedly. He also had John Bolton in his cabinet, so I'll let you put that math together. And he's also, violently, it's weird, he's taken some half steps on criminal justice reform, but it's mostly just a photo op. Let's call it what it is, right? Oh, he's freed a few thousand people. Americans are still going to prison every single day for marijuana violations. People in legal states are still facing the possibility of federal prosecution, depending on whoever happens to win the White House in 2020 and what their particular drug policy is. The fact is, no one's really done anything about any of this, right? We've known for forever that it hasn't worked, and our game plans still haven't changed. So what I would like to propose is that these people that are leading us are either way too ignorant to ever be some of these people sound so ignorant that I wouldn't let them manage a lemonade stand in front of my house, right? Are you going to sell lemonade for a penny a cup and then wonder why you're not making any money and then ask for... I don't get it. When a process doesn't work, it doesn't take a whole lot of time and realization to change that, usually, right? Granted, this is government, the all-slow government, but I also kind of want to go a step further. And that step is that all of these politicians, all the ones that are tough on crime, all the ones that say that they're tough on terror and they're going to fight the terrorists, they know that they can't win. They know that these policies suck, and they know that their policies, and are very willing to go as far as to kill people for the sake of these policies, because as we've said before, there is not a single law on the books that implicitly the government isn't willing to kill you for. So then why have we stuck to these policies, and why have they continued to be very, very defensive of these policies that just haven't worked? So I want to break it down a little bit here. I want to take it step by step. Now, obviously, the whole war on drugs thing has been one of the things that I've talked a whole lot on this show about. I'm not going to beat a dead horse here, although I could for quite a while. But let's just establish the basis that anyone objectively looking at this legal system can understand. We've locked up hundreds of thousands of people. We've given, in North Dakota, it's 218,000 people have criminal convictions, largely due to drug crimes. We've killed unknown amounts of people, right? Not only enforcing these laws, not only people that have been caught up in the black markets, people that aren't even involved in it, right? Think about the single mother who's walking home from work who gets killed in a gang shootout over a drug territory over a prohibited substance. Think about the people that have died because they took what they thought was cocaine or heroin and instead got a whole bunch of fentanyl. Think about all these deaths. And not even related to the manufacturing. Think about how many people the literal hell and slave plantations that they run in parts of South America in order to produce this cocaine, which Americans eagerly snort up at high prices because the federal government hasn't realized that prohibition doesn't work yet. And you've got untold millions of people who have died directly or indirectly, and think of the millions of other people who've been impacted. Think about the kids who've grown up without a dad or without a mom because they were busted in an overzealous criminal justice system that seeks to throw around the weight of the law on anyone that prohibits any of these relatively minor substance violations, right? And this doesn't even begin to get into the fact that we gave rise to these cartels under the Obama administration. We gave these cartels guns. A whole lot of stuff has gone on here, not to mention the rumors that the CIA was, helping to bring in the cocaine in the 1980s. It's a very, very big... There's a cluster word that I can't say on the air that I really want to say about that, but that's what it is. It's pretty obvious it is, right? And states are even beginning to realize it with legalization of marijuana and stuff. But I want to go further. Look at how many people have died because they haven't had access to the proper treatment that we are finding out after 50 years of suppression by the federal and international governments. Some of these substances, psilocybin, MDMA, ketamine, etc., can have great benefits for people suffering from certain types of treatment-resistant depression, anxiety, PTSD, assuming they're done therapeutically and all of that great stuff, set and setting, whatever. I do not hold a PhD in anything, much less advanced neuroscience and understanding depression. But from what we have from the very little research that we've been allowed to do, these things could seriously save lives. One of the biggest causes of death, it might even be the biggest cause of death for young, otherwise healthy people, is suicide. Suicide numbers have been climbing, and then, interestingly enough, in response to the drug war, do you know who's committing suicide in higher numbers every single day? People that suffer from chronic pain, because in an attempt to crack down on the opioid epidemic, they've started taking away pain medication from people that actually need their pain medication. And of course, a lot of these people live in places where you can't easily get access to things like medical marijuana, and that has resulted in a stunningly high number of suicides from people who are suffering from chronic pain. The situation has gotten so bad that doctors are now telling pain patients to just suck it up and do yoga. Meditate. That'll get rid of the pain. And none of this was at all unpredictable. Go back to the initial debates. Listen to the people that were around during the start of the war on drugs. Listen to, I forget his exact name, but one of Nixon's top aides admitted that they did it so that they could break up the hippies and the blacks by associating them with heroin and pot use, respectively. Not to mention the fact that marijuana and cocaine were only banned after racist attacks that insinuated that cocaine made white women crazy for blacks or vice versa, and that marijuana made Mexicans all hyped up. I don't know. It's some really corny, racist, 90-year-old propaganda, and that's what we're basing our drug laws off of. So the question I put out there is and some of the politicians, I hate AOC on most issues. She's right when she calls out the drug war. There are people that are beginning to call it out, but for the most part, what are these politicians doing? Because now we've entered into this weird stage where politicians know that it's not so popular to just throw away anyone that uses substances, right? We're kind of beginning to evolve past that as a society after a very dark 100 years or so. But what they can claim to do, and it's really tricky because they like to play both sides, is that they can ask for, slow, incremental changes with a bunch of loopholes. A perfect example of this, and I was so mad that people were celebrating it as even a minor victory. In Hawaii, they decriminalized marijuana, but they only decriminalized 3.5 grams, or an eighth of an ounce. Almost no one who actually uses marijuana buys an eighth of an ounce at a time, meaning effectively that you don't have decriminalization, right? But people are still cheering for it and acting like they've solved the war on drugs. So why do we keep sticking to these policies? And by the way, right, the thing that I really, really want to emphasize here is that it's not like it's not like we've taken on a lot of these policies just in the last decade and we're just starting to check the receipts, right? It's not like everyone around 2010 was like, hey, Let's start locking people up for drugs. Let's see how that plays out over a short designated time frame. We have had literally decades of results to go over these. But it hasn't worked. And what's happened actually as a result of this prohibition? Because the thing that a lot of people would love to say is that, and what they said back when they started these horrific wars is we're going to stop the pot use, we're going to stop the cocaine use, we're going to stop the heroin use, we're going to make it so expensive to do those drugs that no one's going to be able to get them, it's going to go out of business. However, that's not what happened. Shocker. Do you know what the government has managed to do, though? It's a direct result of the black markets, because I'm not saying that cocaine or even marijuana or whatever is good for you. What I am saying is, even though we don't really have a ton of research on it because, the federal government is apparently actively trying to kill people, or at least indirectly doing so, but we have some relative knowledge of how things work, right? We know how to respond, for example, to a cocaine overdose, or if someone takes too much MDMA. Hey, we have a relatively easy idea of what works to make sure that that person at least doesn't die. However, what has happened as a direct result of the federal government waging an all-out war on these substances is that, while also not dealing at all and only encouraging the black market, is that synthetic drugs have risen up in place. According to the DEA, synthetic drugs are drugs that are novel new substances that are made to mimic other drugs. There's a big example that off of bath salts or Flocco, where that guy allegedly ate a homeless dude's face off. That particular brand of substances is made to mimic either cocaine, methamphetamine, or MDMA. Not to mention we have things like fentanyl coming up that are taking the place of more traditional opioids. We had the K2 or spice. If you remember that came out a few years ago by this point, where people, because they didn't want to do an illegal drug, were doing things that were technically not illegal, still widely available, and way more harmful. I would also like to point out that the other big thing about this is that the federal government, of course, because of how laws work and stuff, can only have jurisdiction of their borders, which means that in an increasingly decentralized age, it is incredibly easy to go onto any number of Chinese websites and buy any number of precursors or actual pharmaceuticals. Buy the kilogram, buy the pound, buy the ton, buy whatever you want. And there's literally thousands of distributors out there doing this, pumping out precursors and chemicals that are made to mimic other drugs. So instead of having a war on instead of having people having trouble with relatively known substances, we've opened the Pandora's box of incredibly new and novel substances. The thing about it, though, is the only way that the government has responded to this rise in novel drug use is more prohibition, which we've already established doesn't work. So what we're really kind of coming to here is that, everything that the government has done in regards to the war on drugs has obviously only made the situation worse, right? And yet but they're not doing the things that would obviously get us out of this horrible situation. Very few politicians are coming up and saying, you know what, not only do we need to legalize marijuana use, not even many are willing to come out and say that we need to decriminalize all drug use. Very few are coming out and saying, well, we need to deal with the problems that we have instead of, bungling through them and getting a whole nother, because what I fear and what I've said I've feared for a long while is a world in which fentanyl overdoses are not accidental, but a world in which people get hooked on fentanyl and then are no longer even able to return to things like heroin, thus ensuring a permanent supply of fentanyl in the United States. That sounds very, very terrifying. And like I said, this has been, despite the government locking a lot of people up, it hasn't been any tougher to get drugs on the streets of the United States of America. People are still going to do whatever the hell they want to do, and this is well known. We had a decade of prohibition in the 1920s to show that it doesn't work. What happened during prohibition? They went from drinking beer to drinking bathtub gin, and we as a country said, this doesn't make sense, let's do the less harmful thing. Despite that knowledge, our politicians, out of either ignorance or some type of malice, are continuing to allow this sick, idiotic, murderous system to continue. Think about that. And I implore anyone that's listening to really take a good, hard moment. There are people in positions of power right now that have thought through exactly what I am saying. I am not the first person to come out and say this stuff, and I'm certainly not the first person that's looked at this system and gone, this seems a little more than counterintuitive and counterproductive. And yet people in positions of power at all levels at the government continue to let it happen. What do we call that when someone allows innocents to die because of their own negligence? In most cases, that would be a criminal or at least a civil charge, but they continue to keep getting paid from it, and what's more, they get campaign contributions from prison industries, police unions, and a whole lot of other groups so that they can continue killing Americans. That's what it is, right? That's exactly what it is. Because each and every one of these laws they've shown, they are not above sending in literal, pretty much paramilitaries in order to bust up over these substances. It's a war on drugs, and they have waged war on the American people. And like I said, out of ignorance, cowardice, or just malice, they refuse to do the smart, brave, and sensible thing, and they refuse to save lives. It's an explicit allowing for more people to die, subsidized by your tax dollars. And I also really kind of want to, and we've talked a lot about the drug war, but I also kind of want to talk about the utter hypocrisy of a lot of these so-called criminal justice reforms, right? Donald Trump is making some progress on it. He's had some smaller reforms, the First Step Act, which, I applaud them, but why is that the only thing that we're seeing? I mean, Donald Trump is, the executive in this country. Couldn't he just issue a blank pardon like Jimmy Carter did to all the people that dipped out on the Vietnam War? Couldn't he do that? Couldn't he get thousands of people, tens of thousands of people out of federal confinement tomorrow? Couldn't he get millions or hundreds of thousands of Americans off of parole and probation if he wanted to? Not to mention the clout that Donald Trump holds within the Republican Party or other powerful people, that they could flip a lot of important people on this subject relatively simply. And like I said, despite a bone being thrown here or there, prison is a huge industry. In 2013, per the Department of Justice, more than 7 million Americans were involved in the system, either via probation or parole, in prison, in some type of other facility, in county jail, what do you name it. And furthermore, according to the Pew Research Center, we have a recidivism rate of roughly 40% over the first 3 years in this country. That came from, I believe that statistic was from 2014 whereabouts, so that number could have gone down from then. My point being, we have a massive recidivism rate, we have a massive criminal justice problem, and despite all of the tall talk that we've heard, we've only had some very, very small results. And despite all of the, the talk that we're having at the national level, some things that are happening in different localities in this country are just horrendous. There was what recently happened in Mississippi. I forget the exact name of the prison, but they had black mold. There were sleeping like 5 or 6 people to one jail cell. Toilets weren't working. They were being fed bad food. And prisoners actually had to smuggle in cell phones in order to report it. So they had to break the law in order to report that the people that were, being charged with your tax dollars to keep them relatively healthy and safe were also breaking the law. So just think, and I also want to bring up how bad we've accepted that a lot of how we do prisons, even if we can't fix it overnight, we've accepted that a lot of what we do in them is wrong and bad, right? That's a kind of a widely understood conundrum, is that we need to start, we can't just lock our way out of any of these societal problems. Even jail wardens are starting to say that. And yet how we do things in this country is for so many nonviolent offenses. What's the first thing that we do to people? We give them a jail sentence, we lock them up, we get them involved in somehow in the criminal justice system, even if it's parole or probation. Then, of course, if they trip up there, they go right to jail or wherever. So despite all of the tall talk that we've seen, we continue to send a lot of people there, and we continue to not actually take the steps that we need to that would actually reduce some of the that would actually reduce this number. So we've heard talk, we've heard a lot of little steps, but really, when is someone going to come out and say what's incredibly obvious and actually do the right thing? When is Donald Trump going to come out and just start mass pardoning people? I mean, why should someone who sold, I don't know, I mean, I know people that, you hear the horror stories of people that sell less than $100 a weed 3 times. They get hit with a 3 strikes law and they're in prison for decades and decades and decades, including in states where marijuana is now fully legal. So you have people rotting away for a few pounds of something that's now being traded legally by the ton in a significant portion of this country. That's incredibly wrong, that's incredibly obviously wrong, and that's a waste of taxpayer resources. Yet for all the reform-minded people that claim to stand up for, that claim to be for criminal justice reform, that want to reduce it, we're still sending more people there every single day. So at this point, you have to, once again, you have to question what a lot of these people are seeing out of it, a lot of these legislators, a lot of these people that advocate for it, and once again, what they're seeing out of it is the dollar signs. Because, as we've established before, they really, really, really don't care about you. Now, I want to be clear. In 40 or 50 years, we're going to look back on the war on drugs, hell, maybe only in 20 or 30 years, and we're going to see it exactly the way that we saw the Jim Crow laws of the century previously. We're going to see it similarly to how we saw the abhorrent practices, like child labor and things like that. It's going to be considered absolutely just such an incredible social wrong. And my God, how dare our generation just drag our feet on this? You know what I mean? Because that's exactly what we've done. I also kind of want to dip in a little bit, and I know that our we had this Afghanistan peace deal that kind of broke down, but they did have reduction in fighting. But even if we were to get out of Afghanistan magically tomorrow, that doesn't undo all of what we're dealing with, right? We're involved in Iraq, we're involved in parts of Africa, not to mention the other conflicts in the Middle East. We are literally everywhere, all across the globe. And, not to mention the fact that ISIS, Al-Qaeda, all of those people were literally, not figuratively, literally funded by the United States. But our core stance to counterterrorism hasn't changed, right? Because what's happened over the last few decades is that, even for the people that we're not directly arming, right? Even assuming that those ISIS terrorists truly did just get those long lines of white Toyota trucks on eBay or Alibaba or one of those sketchy Chinese sites, our actions, our indiscriminate support of Saudi Arabia and our needless meddling in the Middle East has killed hundreds of thousands of civilians by the smallest estimate, by the most conservative estimate. We've killed 1/4 to 1/3 of a million people, innocent people, in our war on terror in the Middle East. I ask each and every person listening, how many people in your family, assuming that you're, just trying to go about your life, would have to be killed by a foreign government using vastly superior technology to what you deal with every single day, with the knowledge that they're spending good money on it, by the way, while you live in utter poverty, if your daughter gets killed because she happened to be someplace that was a few blocks away from where a terrorist was hanging out, or if your wife or your husband was murdered while they were walking home because they were mistaken for a member of a terrorist group. And then think about how many times we've done exactly that. It used to be standard operating procedure for the United States Department of Defense to target funerals of suspected terrorists on the assumption that other terrorists would show up. I ask you, and like Ron Paul questioned when he was running for president in 2008 and 2012, how much blowback are we prepared to endure? Because as long as we continue these policies, we're going to get the same results, which is that people will continue to not like our country and that people will continue to resent the United States. Effectively, we make it easier not only for the terrorists to fundraise, but also for them to recruit amongst these vulnerable populations. Because like I said, we're only making it worse. And this is happening right now, where, how many times do you read about America selling hundreds of billions of dollars in arms to Saudi Arabia? And then look at what Saudi Arabia is doing in Yemen, in that violent proxy war with Iran. And then think about how the people in Yemen must feel seeing American-made bombs drop on a conflict that we're not only involved in, but that, at the end of the day is a power struggle, has nothing to do with the actual people living in Yemen. And yet that's our standard operating procedure. We've known that it hasn't worked for a while, and you'd think that if we could bomb our way to peace in the Middle East after 20 effing years of bombing the Middle East and arming people to bomb the Middle East and getting funding passed to bomb the Middle East, we could have done it by now. But it's still incredibly unstable. We still have proxy wars, not to mention we've actually emboldened Russia and other regional influences by destabilizing the region. We've only made the situation worse and allied ourselves with horrible people. And yet we haven't had any major attempts to bring the troops home. We simply haven't reined it in. No one's come out and said enough is enough. We're bringing them home tomorrow. And, this is kind of a little bit larger of a net because this is on both Democrats and Republicans. Because under Democratic administrations, we bombed them. Under the current Republican administration, we're bombing them. If Joe Biden, Bloomberg, or even Sanders wins, I guarantee you the American bombs will still be dropping in the Middle East. It's utter nonsense, and people are either sticking their heads in the sand or they're willfully allowing this ignorant policy to happen. And all that America's gotten out of this is trillions of dollars of debt, thousands of dead Americans, and hundreds of thousands of dead civilians with a decreased and tarnished reputation across the world. Not only was this not a fair trade-off, this was, for the United States, a suicide for our international reputation. And yet, due to moneyed special interests, we continue to fight these pointless wars, continue to spend your tax dollars, and continue to send our sons and daughters to fight and die needlessly while generating resentment across the world that guarantees that under the guise of fighting the next generation of terrorists, we will continue to take from you and your family to kill a bunch of brown people. Fantastic. And then just think about how many politicians on both sides are just allowing that to happen. Because every day that they're not actively opposing it and standing up to it, that's exactly what they're doing. And I kind of want to close out on something that gets tied up in these debates really, really easily, right? Whenever you start saying, these politicians, there's always like a little clamor of how much public service and all that stuff, and it's this weird syndrome where it's obvious that politicians are making America a lot worse, right? I mean, hell, I just spent a half an hour detailing pretty explicitly how, and I'm not even going into a super great degree of detail. I am by no means an expert on a lot of this stuff. I don't have a doctorate. I don't have a master's. I haven't written my thesis about any of this. None of that. But it's not that tough to distinguish. So why is it that in this country we continue to worship politicians at the state, local, and federal levels? Seriously, why is it that we see, senators and congressmen and bureaucrats of all different types as some type of demigods? And I will leave you with that, and I'll take a quick little break. This has been the Crazy Libertarian. I'll be right back. Hey there, we are back with the song of the day, and I wanted to do something, I was want to do something a little bit different, but I guess this one kind of gets to my roots, right? I'm wearing the flannel with a t-shirt under it. I was feeling something punk today, because it's a very punk message. It's essentially saying that the entire system is working against us, and damn it, we need to wake up to it. So I figured today I would play JFA by JFA. Both of those stand for Jodie Foster's Army. This was one of the first hardcore skate punk bands to come out. They dropped their EP Blatant Localism in 1980. It kicked off skate punk, so if you've ever really jammed out to Green Day or anything like that, you've kind of sort of got these guys to thank for that. And this song is to me, it just kind of sums up the overarching, and yeah, it's a little bit, excessive, but that's what makes good music, right? Hyperbole makes excellent music. And it's just about how, you know what, we're not going to take it, and damn it, we're going to do the unpopular things, we're going to say the unpopular things, and we're going to make some very loud and obnoxious points to point out how sick and how crazy and how messed up this country and this government have really gotten. So, in that attitude, I have JFA by JFA. You'll love this one.